In the spring of 1971, Kurt Dahl walked into the Geneva National Bank in Fillmore County, Nebraska, to apply for a $14,000 equipment loan. His first year farming the home place, after his father stepped back from active operation, and the first time Kurt had sat across a loan officer's desk as the man responsible for the farm rather than the man who carried his father's paperwork. The loan officer, a heavy-set man named Garrett with reading glasses on a broad nose and a bolo tie, had reviewed the application. He had looked at the farm summary Kurt had prepared: 180 acres, corn, soybeans, hogs, a small beef cow herd, a 1-acre market garden, 5 income streams across one farm. Garrett had looked at the 180-acre total. He had said, "Mr. Dahl, 180 acres is not a viable farm operation in today's agricultural economy." He had said, "The Extension Office recommends a minimum of 400 acres for a corn-soybean operation to achieve the economies of scale necessary for long-term viability." He had approved the loan. Kurt's credit was sound and the collateral was solid, but Garrett had said it while signing the approval, as if the $14,000 was a courtesy extended to a young man who would likely be selling the farm within a decade. Kurt had said nothing. He had taken the loan documents. He had driven home on the 18 miles of county road back to the farm. He had gone to the barn and done the evening chores. He had paid off the $14,000 in 3 years. He had not returned to the Geneva National Bank for another loan. He had not needed to. In the fall of 2011, Kurt Dahl sat at the kitchen table with the November ledger open, the same composition notebook his father had started in 1948, the same 4 columns his father had drawn, the same November accounting that told you whether the year had been made or lost. He wrote the 2011 entry. He totaled the columns. He put the pen down. Positive, as it had been every November for 40 consecutive years. He called his son in from the barn. He said, "Come look at this." His son came and looked at the ledger. He said, 40 years. Kurt said, "Not one in the red." His son said, "The loan officer said it wasn't viable." Kurt said, "He said a lot of things." He closed the ledger. He said, "The farm said otherwise." Let me tell you about the 5-legged stool, because the 5-legged stool is the hidden advantage, and it is the reason 180 acres in Fillmore County produced 40 consecutive positive November entries when farms 3 times its size were going to the bank. Kurt's father, Eldon, had designed the 5-enterprise system in the late 1940s from a specific observation about how farm income failed. He had watched single-enterprise farms in the county, corn-only operations, hog-only operations, cattle-only operations, go through the specific crisis that any single-enterprise farm goes through when its one commodity price drops in the year the farm cannot absorb the drop. He had watched corn at $1.10 in 1953 put corn-only operations in the red. He had watched hog prices collapse in 1955 and hog-only operations struggle through 2 thin years. He had decided he was not going to be in a position where one price decided the year. He had built 5 enterprises instead, not 5 equal enterprises. The corn and soybeans were the largest by acreage and the most significant by gross revenue in good years. But the hogs provided income in the months between corn and soybean checks. The beef cows used the rough ground along the East Creek that was not suitable for row crops and would have otherwise produced nothing. The market garden produced weekly cash income from May through October, not large amounts, $30 to $80 a week at the Geneva Farmers Market, but weekly cash that kept the operating account from running empty in the months when the row crop income was months away. He had called it the five-legged stool. He had said, "You can kick out one leg and the stool still stands." He had said, "You cannot kick out all five at once." He had said, "In my experience, prices do not all collapse at once. Different enterprises move on different cycles." He had said, "When corn is down, hogs may be up. When hogs are down, beef may be holding. When row crops are thin, the garden still brings something in on Saturday morning." He had handed this system to Kurt in 1971 when he stepped back. He had not handed Kurt a management manual. He had handed him 40 years of November ledger entries showing how the five-enterprise system had produced a positive outcome in every year, including the thin ones, and he had said, "Keep all five legs on the stool." Kurt had kept all five legs on the stool. Let me tell you about what keeping all five legs meant in practice, because it was not always convenient, and it was not always what the extension office or the farm lenders or the neighbors were recommending. In 1974, when corn prices ran to $3.40 per bushel and every extension bulletin in Nebraska was recommending expanding row crop acreage, the most efficient move for Kurt would have been to convert the rough creek bottom pasture to cropland, sell the beef cows, and put every acre into corn. The math was compelling. At $3.40, additional corn acres paid handsomely. Several of his neighbors had made exactly this conversion. Kurt had not converted. The rough ground along the East Creek was not reliably tileable. 2 attempts by previous owners had shown that the creek's drainage patterns made conventional tile drainage expensive and uncertain on that ground. The beef cows were using ground that would not have produced reliable corn yields even if he had tried to convert it. He had kept the cows on the creek ground and kept the stool at 5 legs. In 1983, when corn dropped to $2.60 and the hog market was also soft simultaneously, Kurt's corn column was negative for the first time in his farming career. Not the whole farm, just the corn column. But the hog column, while soft, was positive. The beef column was positive. Cattle prices had not followed the corn collapse because cattle move on a longer cycle. The garden column was its normal, modest positive. The farm's total net for 1983 was $4,100. Not good, not comfortable, not enough to make plans from, but positive. The stool had 4 legs functioning when the 5th was weak, and 4 functioning legs held the stool. His neighbor to the north had converted entirely to corn and soybeans in 1974. By 1983, he was carrying $380,000 in land debt at 14% interest with corn at $2.60. His interest service was $53,200. His crop income before inputs was approximately $91,000. After inputs of $240 per acre on 480 acres, his net before interest was $6,600. Against $53,200 in interest. He restructured in 1984. He sold 160 acres in 1986. The Farm Credit System took the remaining 320 acres in 1988. Kurt's total debt in 1983 was $22,000, an equipment note he had taken in 1979 for a used combine. His annual interest service was $2,640. His farm had generated $4,100 net. After interest, $1,460 in his pocket. Not comfortable, but the farm was his. Let me tell you about the market garden specifically, because it is the enterprise everyone underestimates and the one that turned out to matter most in the thin years. The 1-acre market garden was not Kurt's idea or Eldon's idea. It was Kurt's mother Vera's idea, established in 1948 as a household vegetable garden that had grown over the years into a market operation when Vera began selling surplus at the Geneva Farmers Market in 1952. By the time Kurt was farming the place in 1971, the market garden was a 20-year-old established enterprise with a regular customer base at the Saturday Geneva market and an annual net income of approximately $2,200 to $3,800 depending on the season. This is not a large number in the context of a row crop operation, but it was weekly cash from mid-May through mid-October, a period when the row crop income was months away in either direction. It was the enterprise that kept the operating account above zero when the corn and soybean income was post-harvest and the hog income was between cycles. It was the enterprise that bought groceries and paid the electric bill in July when every other income stream was in a wait state. Kurt had told the loan officer in 1971 about the market garden. Garrett had looked at the $2,200 to $3,800 annual income figure and had not included it in his viability analysis. He had said, "We don't typically count garden income as part of the agricultural operation for lending purposes." Kurt had said nothing. He had included the garden income in every November ledger entry for 40 years. It had been part of every positive number. The garden was also the enterprise that other farmers could not replicate quickly. You cannot decide in March that you will have a successful farmer's market garden by June. Vera had built the customer relationships over 20 years. Kurt had maintained them over 40 more. The Geneva Saturday market customers who bought Dahl tomatoes and sweet corn and butternut squash were not buying vegetables. They were buying from the Dahls specifically because they had been doing so since Vera had set up her first table in 1952. That relationship had value that did not appear in any extension viability analysis. Let me tell you about 1985, because 1985 is the year that tested the five-legged stool most severely and the year Kurt understood most fully why Eldon had built it. In 1985, corn was $2.23 per bushel. Hog prices had been soft since 1984 and remained soft through most of 1985. The beef market was also under pressure. 3 of Kurt's 5 legs were having difficult years simultaneously. The garden was its normal, modest positive. The soybeans, which moved on a somewhat different price cycle than corn, were positive but thin. Kurt's 1985 November entry, $2,800 net, the thinnest year in the 40-year ledger, thinner than 1983, thinner than any year his father had recorded, but positive. The stool had not fallen. 3 weak legs and 2 functional legs had produced $2,800 net on a 180-acre Fillmore County operation in the worst farm year of the decade. His neighbor to the south, not the one who had lost everything in 1988, a different neighbor, a man named Vrana, who had expanded to 360 acres in the 1970s with production loans, had that same year, 1985, generated a net loss of $28,000 after debt service. He had sold his equipment at auction in the spring of 1986 and rented his ground to a larger operator while he took a job in Geneva. Kurt had driven past the Vrana equipment auction on the way to the Geneva market. He had not stopped. He had gone to the market, sold his vegetables, driven home. He had $2,800 for the year. He had kept all 5 legs on the stool. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments, have you ever been told your operation was too small to be viable? Tell me what happened. Let me tell you about the November ledger itself, because it is the object that carries the 40-year proof. Eldon had started the ledger in 1948, a composition notebook with 4 columns: gross income, input costs, debt service, net. He had made the November entry every year from 1948 through 1970, 22 consecutive years, before handing the farm to Kurt. Kurt had continued the ledger in the same notebook until it was full in 1982, then had started a second notebook in the same format. By 2011, he had filled 2.5 notebooks. He had shown Garrett the ledger in 1971. Garrett had glanced at it. He had said, "This is historical data, Mr. Dahl. Historical performance does not guarantee future viability." Kurt had nodded. He had taken the ledger home. In 2011, when Kurt's son looked at the ledger after the 40th consecutive positive entry, he had found Garrett's 1971 visit referenced in a margin note in Kurt's handwriting. The note said simply, "Loan officer said not viable." He had written it in the margin of the 1971 entry, which showed a net of $8,400. The first year Kurt had farmed the place alone. The margin note was not triumphant. It was not bitter. It was a fact recorded alongside the other facts, the way a farmer records everything that matters in the November accounting. The loan officer said it. The ledger answered it. 40 years of November entries, none of them in the red, had answered it more completely than any argument Kurt could have made in 1971. He had not needed to argue. He had needed to farm. Let me tell you what Eldon said when he drew the first 4 columns in 1948, because it is the sentence that built the stool and the ledger and the 40-year record that neither Garrett nor the Extension Office could have predicted from their minimum 400-acre viability model. Eldon had said, "A farm is not viable or not viable based on its size. It is viable or not viable based on whether it produces more than it costs every year." He had paused. A 180-acre farm that produces more than it costs every year is more viable than a 500-acre farm that produces less than it costs in the bad years. He had looked at Kurt. "The ledger tells you which one you have." He had paused. "Keep the entries honest and the stool at 5 legs. The rest takes care of itself." Kurt had kept the entries honest. He had kept the stool at 5 legs. The rest had taken care of itself for 40 years. The loan officer's branch closed in 1994. The farm is still in the family. His son farms it now on the same 5 enterprises. He has added a 6th, a small CSA subscription service that replaced the farmer's market operation when Kurt retired. and he makes a November ledger entry every year in the same composition notebook format Eldon designed in 1948. Not 1 year in the red, not 1 year. The loan officer said it was not viable. The ledger said otherwise. The ledger has been saying otherwise every November for longer than the bank that housed the loan officer has existed. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments. Does your family farm have a ledger like this one? What does it show? A farm is viable or not viable based on whether it produces more than it costs every year? Eldon said it in 1948. Kurt proved it from 1971 to 2011. His son is proving it now. 180 acres, 5 legs, 40 years, not 1 year in the red. The loan officer was wrong about the size. He was right that the ledger would tell you. The ledger told you. It has been telling you every November for a long time now, and it has not changed its answer. Let me tell you about what the 5 enterprise system meant across an entire calendar year, because the timing of the income streams is as important as the diversity of them. And the timing is what the loan officer's 400-acre viability model completely missed. A single enterprise corn-soybean operation in Fillmore County receives its income in 2 concentrated windows. The corn check arrives in October and November after harvest, and the soybean check arrives at roughly the same time or whenever the farmer chooses to sell from storage. For 8 to 9 months of the year, from November through the following October, a corn-soybean operation is spending money without receiving significant income. The operating loan carries the gap. The operating loan costs interest. The interest is a drag on the net. Kurt's 5 enterprise system distributed income across the calendar in a way that reduced the operating loan requirement and the interest drag. The hog operation produced income on a roughly 2-cycle-per-year basis. Farrow to finish hogs marketed at approximately 6-month intervals, with the income arriving in spring and fall. The beef cows produced a calf crop in the spring that was marketed in the fall. A second fall income stream that arrived roughly simultaneously with the corn and soybean checks, but from a different market. The market garden produced income every Saturday from mid-May through mid-October. Approximately 22 weeks of weekly deposits, ranging from $30 to $120 per market day. The result was an operating account that was never completely empty for more than a few weeks at a time. The winter gap, November through April, was the thinnest period, when the raw crop and beef income from the fall was drawn down and the spring hog cycle and garden income had not yet begun. But the winter gap was approximately 5 to 6 months rather than the 9 to 10 months that a pure grain operation experienced. The operating loan Kurt carried in a typical year was approximately $8,000 to $12,000. The gap between what the winter expenses required and what the fall income had left in the account. At a 12% operating rate in the early 1980s, this meant interest costs of approximately $960 to $1,440 per year. His neighbor, farming 360 acres on a grain-only operation, was carrying $45,000 to $60,000 in annual operating loans at the same rate, $5,400 to $7,200 in annual interest just on the operating loan, before the land debt service. The difference in annual interest cost between Kurt's operation and his 360-acre neighbors was approximately $4,500 to $6,000 per year. Across the thin years of the early 1980s, that difference was the difference between being positive and being negative. Eldon had understood this. He had not used the phrase cash flow management or income stream diversification. Those terms did not exist in the vocabulary of a 1948 Nebraska farmer. He had said, "I want money coming in every month of the year if I can manage it." He had said, "The months with no money coming in are the months the bank makes its money from you." He had said, "If I can keep something coming in most months, I keep more of what I grow." He had been right. The five-legged stool was also a cash flow system. The legs that looked like small enterprises, the hogs, the beef cows, the market garden, were also income timing devices that kept the operating account healthier than a grain-only operation of any size could manage on the same cash base. Let me tell you about the one conversation Kurt had with his son the winter before he handed over the farm in 2011, because the conversation is where the inheritance is transmitted, and the transmission matters as much as the ledger. Kurt's son, his name is Joel, had been working alongside his father for 3 years before the formal handover, learning the operation from the inside, the way a farm transition works when it is done well. He had been through 2 full crop years, 3 hog cycles, 2 calf crops, and 2 full market garden seasons. He knew the operation mechanically. What Kurt had needed to transmit was not the mechanism, it was the principle. They had been in the barn on a January evening doing hog chores in the cold when Kurt had stopped at the farrowing pen and leaned on the gate. He had said, "When somebody tells you this operation is too small, what do you say?" Joel had looked at his father. He said, "I say it's been positive for 40 years. Kurt had said, "That is the right answer." He paused, "But it is not why." He looked at the sows in the farrowing pen. He said, "The reason it has been positive for 40 years is that we have never let one price decide the year." He paused. "The hogs are not here because they make us rich. The beef cows are not on the creek ground because cattle are glamorous. The garden is not there because your grandmother liked growing tomatoes." He looked at Joel. "They are here because when corn and soybeans go wrong, something else is still working." He paused. "That is the whole system, 5 legs. Never let anybody talk you out of a leg." Joel said, "The extension office says the garden is not worth the time." Kurt said, "The extension office does not make your November entry." He looked at his son. In 1985, the garden was the margin between positive and negative, not the corn, not the hogs, the garden. He paused. $3,200 from the Geneva Saturday market was the difference between a year in the black and a year in the red. He paused. "Don't let anybody call that not worth the time." Joel had kept all 5 legs on the stool. He has added a 6th, a community-supported agriculture subscription box that replaced the farmer's market operation when Kurt stepped back from driving to Geneva every Saturday. The CSA distributes to 40 families in Fillmore County from May through October. The income is more predictable than the market table had been and arrives on a weekly subscription basis. The calendar distribution is the same. The principle is the same. He makes the November entry every year. It has been positive every year. He has farmed the place. Let me tell you one final thing about the Geneva National Bank, because the bank's timeline alongside the farm's timeline is the story's sharpest single fact. The Geneva National Bank opened in 1921. It operated through the Depression, the wartime years, the post-war agricultural expansion, the farm crisis of the 1980s. In 1989, it was acquired by a regional holding company in a merger that was presented as a strengthening of the bank's position. The Geneva branch, the specific branch where Garrett had reviewed Kurt's application in 1971 and approved the $14,000 loan while calling 180 acres not viable, had closed in 1994 as part of a branch consolidation by the acquiring company. The closing had been a business decision, not a failure. The acquiring company had determined that the Geneva market did not support a full-service branch, given the population density and the competition from a competing regional bank that had a stronger position in Fillmore County. The closure was announced in April 1994 and completed by June. Kurt had driven past the building after the closure. He had not stopped. He had noted it the way he noted anything on the county road. A fact among other facts, no more or less significant than the price board at the elevator. He had gone home and done the chores. He had not mentioned it to anyone at the time. He had mentioned it once, years later, in the context of the 1971 conversation when his son had asked him how he had felt when the bank said 180 acres was not viable. Kurt had said, "I felt like I needed to pay off the $14,000 and then farm the 180 acres until the number proved itself." He had paused. I was not angry at the loan officer. He was making the assessment his institution trained him to make. He paused. His institution closed in 1994. He paused. The farm is still here. That is the complete answer, not triumphant, not bitter, just the facts placed beside each other without embellishment. The loan officer said 180 acres was not viable. The farm produced 40 positive November entries. The bank closed. The farm is still here. Eldon had said in 1948, a farm is viable or not viable based on whether it produces more than it costs every year. By that definition, the Dahl farm has been viable for every year it has existed under the Dahl name. The institution that said otherwise is closed. The five-legged stool is still standing. Let me tell you about the years between 1971 and 1980, the decade before the crisis, because this is the period when the pressure to abandon the five-legged stool was greatest, and the period when Kurt's refusal to abandon it was most actively tested. From 1973 through 1980, corn prices were strong and trending upward. The Soviet grain purchases of 1972 and 1973 had changed the export picture for American corn, and the prices that followed had changed the calculus of every farm plan in Nebraska. Corn at $3 per bushel in 1974. Corn at $2.50 in 1975, a correction, and then back up. Land values rising to match the income expectations of the high-price era. The banks were lending against rising asset values. The Extension Office was publishing scale analysis, showing that per-unit costs declined meaningfully at 400 acres, at 600 acres, at 800. The economic logic of expansion was not irrational. It was just incomplete. Kurt had watched the expansion happening around him. He had watched his neighbors buying ground at prices that required the high corn price to service. He had run the numbers himself, not on the back of an envelope the way Frank Hetrick would have done, but in the margin of the November ledger where he had space for calculation. He had asked the same question Eldon had taught him to ask: at the bad year corn price, can this operation pay for itself? At $1.80 corn, his estimate of a realistic bad year floor based on the 1960s price history, the additional debt service on 200 more acres at the going land price produced a negative number. The expansion looked profitable at $3 corn. It looked survivable at $2.50. It looked fragile at $2, and it looked negative at $1.80. Kurt had said no to the expansion opportunities that came his way in the 1970s. Not loudly, not with arguments at the co-op, not with predictions about what corn prices would do. He had just said no, run his 180 acres, kept his 5 legs on the stool, and made his November entry. In 1980, corn dropped to $3.11, and the interest rates began their rise toward 21%. In 1982, corn was $2.68. In 1985, $2.23. The bad year floor Kurt had estimated in 1974 arrived in 1985. The operations that had borrowed at the high price assumption were facing exactly the negative number Kurt had calculated in the margin of the ledger in 1974. He had not predicted 1985. He had simply refused to build a structure that 1985 would break. This is the difference between prescience and prudence. Kurt did not know in 1974 that 1985 was coming. He knew in 1974 that some bad year was coming, because bad years always come, and that the test of any farm structure was whether the structure survived the bad year. He had built a structure, 180 acres, 5 legs, no expansion debt, that would survive any bad year he could plausibly imagine. When 1985 arrived and was worse than most bad years he had imagined, the structure held. $2,800 net. Positive. He had written in the margin of the 1985 entry, worse than I expected, still worked. That is the complete agricultural philosophy in 4 words. Still worked. Not brilliantly, not comfortably. Still worked. The stool did not fall. The loan officer's institution did not survive 8 more years after 1985. The farm survived and is still going. Let me also tell you about the specific moment in 1988 when Kurt's neighbor's farm went to the farm credit system, because Kurt was there for part of it, and the moment is in the record. The neighbor to the north, the one who had converted entirely to corn and soybeans in 1974 and was carrying $380,000 in land debt by 1983, had his land sold at a farm credit system auction in April of 1988. Kurt had received notice of the auction in the mail because he owned the adjacent parcel and had right of first refusal under Nebraska's neighboring landowner notification law. He had driven to the auction, not to bid. The farm credit system auction price was still above what his bad year calculation said the ground was worth at the bad year corn price. He had gone to see it. He had stood at the edge of the auction crowd and watched 320 acres of Fillmore County farmland sell to a buyer from Lincoln who was purchasing it as an investment and planned to rent it back to a tenant operator. The neighbor had stood on the other side of the auction area. They had made eye contact once across the crowd. Kurt had nodded. The neighbor had nodded back. Kurt had driven home. He had not written anything about it in the ledger. He had gone to the barn. He had done the evening chores. He had come inside and written the April entry in the operating account, not the November ledger, just the monthly operating notes. And the April entry was routine. Hog income from the spring cycle, garden seed orders, equipment fuel. The farm continued. The neighbor's farm continued under different ownership. The land was still being farmed. The crops still grew. What had changed was not the land. What had changed was who the land belonged to, and whether a Fillmore County family was farming it or a Lincoln investor was collecting rent from it. Kurt had thought about this. He had thought about Eldon saying in 1948 that a farm is viable or not viable based on whether it produces more than it costs every year. The neighbor's farm had produced more than it cost in crop terms. It had not produced more than it cost in total terms. The land debt had been the cost that the crop income could not cover in the years the prices dropped. The land was viable. The debt load was not. Kurt's land was viable. His debt load was also viable. It had always been set at the level that the bad year corn price could service. The two things being true simultaneously was not luck. It was the calculation Eldon had taught him and that he had run in the margin of the ledger in 1974 when the expansion pressure was at its highest. He tells Joel this story every time the topic of expansion comes up, not as a warning, as a reference point. He says, the land is not the question, the debt is the question. He says, always ask whether the bad year price can service the debt. He says, if the answer is no, the land is not worth the debt. Joel asks what the bad year price is. Kurt says, whatever is lower than you think possible. He pauses, then go lower. Whatever price you arrive at, assume a year comes that is worse. He pauses. If the farm still works at that price, take the loan. If it doesn't, walk away from the ground. That is the full transmission of the principle from Eldon to Kurt to Joel. Each generation adding their own year of proof to the ledger. Each generation running the same margin calculation before taking on debt. The five-legged stool is standing. The ledger is positive. The loan officer's institution is closed. The farm continues.